I've seen PhDs say things where I'm like, what? I've seen people who have great physique say stuff where I'm like, are you insane?
How difficult is it to understand science studies without a university degree or experience? As in, can the average YouTuber just go out and read a study, properly extract its findings and conclusions, and make them applicable to everyday viewers? Like the average person, you have people making YouTube channels, they probably have a good bot, and then nowadays you just, study says this, their conclusions. Can people do that? Does it work? I mean, realistically, is that possible?
So I want to be very careful not to sound like I'm in an ivory tower of academia. It's probably possible. It's very, very difficult. And I can just tell you, like, from me being an undergrad, attempting to read studies, going to graduate school, and then actually having been involved in studies, you just have such a better understanding of the limitations of some research. Just like, for example, like people will they might look at something and say, oh, okay, well, look, this happened to their muscle mass. When in reality, it was a study using DEXA, which measures lean body mass and is subject to a lot of variation based on body water, but people don't know that. Or like there was a study a while back that I saw some people come out and say, well, look, this shows, better increases in muscle anabolism. And it was a study looking at whole body protein metabolism, which is much more influenced by the gut and liver turnover than it is by skeletal muscle. And people just don't know those small methodological differences. Like, I understand, I wouldn't consider myself an expert by any means, but like I understand when people talk about doubly labeled water and they're looking at where these labels are going, breath versus urine, all this kind of stuff. Like I understand that. Another great example is there was a meta-analysis that came out recently from a guy named David Ludwig, who's a pretty big low carb proponent. And the statistics were good on it, all this kind of stuff. But basically his conclusion was that low carb diets increased metabolic rate by anywhere from like 100 to 300 calories per day. And when you look at the data, when they had both doubly labeled water and metabolic chamber data available, they used doubly labeled water. Now, some people would read that and go, okay, well, Layne said doubly labeled water measures energy expenditure. Yeah, but that's a surrogate measure. Metabolic chamber is a direct measure, right? So that would be like saying, if somebody's looking at body fat, if they had both DEXA and calipers available, they chose to use the calipers. It's like, no, nobody would ever do that because DEXA is more accurate. DEXA is what calipers are validated against. And so in that study, basically, long story short, we know based on the research that doubly labeled water actually overestimates energy expenditure for low carb diets, that it's not validated for low carb diets. And part of that is, not to get too technical, part of that is because the amount of CO2 that's produced on a low carb diet that you exhale in your breath is greater than what is predicted by the modeling. And that causes the equations to overestimate energy expenditure. Now, if I was somebody who had never had research experience, how the hell am I going to figure that out? You know what I mean? So I think that if you read enough studies, you can get pretty good at it. And you don't need a PhD. Some of the best people out there at assessing studies don't have PhDs, like Greg Nuckols, James Krieger's. They have masters. Minnow Hinzelman's is another good one. But they have still advanced graduate school. And I think I want to stop short of saying it's impossible. It's not impossible. It can be done, but it would be very, very rare. And yes, I cringe quite often when I see some YouTubers try to, break down studies. And I think, like, did you actually read the study? It didn't even say that.
Well, I mean, even myself, I mean, I have a master's degree. I consider myself very intelligent. I was in the dean's list every year, had the highest GPA. And I'm looking at my colleagues that were in my classes, and I'm like, you absolutely missed the boat on this. And these are highly educated, above average, intelligent, smart people, and they're having trouble. And I'll read a study, and I'll send it to my brother, who's a biostatistician, so master's in statistics, and worked on this all the time. And he'll have a different interpretation than I have, because he'll say, well, Greg, you summarized it perfectly. However, the statistical point of this is not explained correctly. He has to explain to doctors about these studies and how they got it wrong. And so I'm thinking, if it takes me and him to properly answer a study or see what it's saying, how can the average person do it? I mean, it's not to like toot our own horns and say, oh, we're smart, but like, if we can't do it, how can the average person do it? And any study can say anything. If you do enough study, do a study over 1,000 times, one of those 1,000 times probably going to say the opposite of what's actually true. And what's that saying? Causation, causality? Do you know that saying?
Yeah, correlation isn't causation.
Exactly. Let's say, I don't know, I bet it's a scientific fact. I bet they'd prove it that consuming ice cream increases drowning rates. If you consume ice cream, you're probably going to drown more. Why? Well, because in the summer, people eat more ice cream, they're swimming more.
Right.
I mean, was it the friggin' ice cream that actually caused the drowning, or the summer weather? So you can't just say one is this, but you can see any study. Oh, Diet Coke is going to cause this and that. Yeah, well, what about this and what about that? And so it's so easy, and the media just spins everything to make it the sexy title that people will click, the clickbait. So that is a huge problem. I mean, I'm sure you've seen that. Like, do you agree? I mean, I'm assuming you do.
Yeah, so I tell people that, every morning I wake up and I eat breakfast, I have coffee, and I answer messages on my phone. Having breakfast or coffee did not cause me to answer messages on my phone, and answering messages on my phone did not cause me to have breakfast or coffee, but they happen with almost a 99% certainty, right? So that's almost a perfect association, but they don't have anything to do with each other, right? And same thing, you can go to a website called Spurious Correlations, and you can find, like, for example, we would consider a relatively strong correlation. We use what's called an R value. We would consider a strong correlation, like in nutrition, above 0.5, I would say. If you get like 0.7, that's really strong. You can find correlations where, like, the divorce rate in Maine is 99% an R of 0.99 related to cheese consumption, or the amount of people drowning is related to Nicolas Cage movies, or the incidence of pirate attacks is somehow related to like space launches. Like, it's insane, and these are correlations all above 0.9. Now, is one causing the other? I very much doubt it. Now, that's not to say that we should completely dismiss things like epidemiology, because people take that too far as well. But epidemiology, which is the study of basically associations that we're talking about here, epidemiology is only really sufficient to ask questions that we can then use to do like randomized control trials and observe what happens. We really shouldn't draw conclusions based on epidemiology.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest pet peeves for my brother, is that people think they can draw conclusions out of studies that are only done to really ask more questions. Like, we're doing this study just to find out some more information to see where should we study next, not just to draw some conclusion. And so, do you think that the availabilities of these studies is actually making it worse? Like, being so quick at our finger, is that helping the fitness industry? The fact that people can just go there and read studies? Like, I feel personally like it's gotten it worse, because people can just use any study. You can say whatever you want. You find your study and you show it. You say, if you eat eggs, you're going to die. If you don't eat eggs, you're going to die. If you eat this food, causing cancer. You don't eat this food, causing cancer. But you can pick out whatever study you want. Is that helping us, hurting us? What's your opinion there?
Yeah, so this is why people are so confused. Now, I think the first thing I'll say is that if we compare what we have today to like 20 years ago, I would say that overall things are better, because at least people are reading studies. I'll give it that. Back in the day, you had Flex Magazine, Muscle and Fitness, Muscular Development, Planet Muscle, or whatever you want, right? And you kind of had to go whatever with what was there, which was basically just brotelligence. Now at least people are reading studies, and you can find really good information. You can find, YouTube channels that are really good sources of information. But you've just got to weed through a lot of crap, unfortunately. And yes, you can always find a study that will support your bias. And this is the biggest problem, is cherry picking. And like, this is when I did a big review of Paul Saladino's appearance on the Joe Rogan podcast. And like, the amount of cherry picking that was done, I mean, you could have started a farm with that many cherries. But a great example is, like, if you look, I in the breakdown, I showed a meta-analysis of the incidence of cigarette smoking and adenocarcinomas. And what you find is that, of course, there is a very powerful overall effect of smoking on adenocarcinomas. But did you know there was one study that actually showed a protective effect of smoking on adenocarcinomas? Now, if I just took that one study and put it out there, am I doing science, or am I cherry picking to support my bias? I'm cherry picking, of course. And so you can always find a study. Now, that doesn't mean the researchers were paid off or anything like that. I think that notion is pretty immature. The fact is, the universe is random, and sometimes shit just happens. Okay, sometimes there's data artifacts, sometimes the studies weren't well designed, and sometimes random stuff just happens. And that is why it's so important to look at the consensus of the data. So this is why, if I'm not an expert in a field, I tend to default to if there is a consensus by the experts in the field, and there's, of course, you can always find a couple of experts who are like wild over on the other side, but I tend to default to the consensus of the field, the meta-analyses, the systematic reviews. And if there's still disagreement among that, then I tend to default to, what do the most tightly controlled studies say, right? Like, so in nutrition, like, what do the metabolic wards say? And I kind of default to those.
Yeah, and so what I see, the biggest problem is that, who do we trust? And so we say, well, this person has 1 million followers, 2 million, 3 million followers, and they're saying this. And the scary thing for me is that the people that often say good information and then they spew out nonsense. So if 3/4 of what you say is good and 1/4 is bad, the people who are following these massive influencers are just going to assume it's all good. And so one myth gets passed on to everyone, and the actual science isn't presented properly. So how are we going to stop that? Like, what can me, you, other people do? Like, what is the answer to that? I mean, can we just stop listening to certain YouTubers? How do we know which ones to follow? Like, I have my theory. I'll let you go first.
I think what you need to look for is actually counterintuitive to what you think. And that is, you need to look for people who say they aren't sure a lot, or they're always adding a lot of context and nuance. They're saying things like maybe, likely, we think, we're not sure, but they're not using superlatives. They're not saying things like always, never, best, worst, those sorts of things. And unfortunately, those are the type of words in titles on YouTube that get a lot of play, right? I get all the time, people ask me, how does your channel not have 1 million subs? How does your channel not have 2 million subs? And I'm like, well, it's probably because I don't do clickbait. Like, I'll try to make it as sexy as I can, but I'm not going to make it, the title something it's not. And so I think that's part of the problem, is that what is going to get you those followers is usually not in line with what is considered evidence-based. And so it can be very, very difficult for somebody to find good information, especially when somebody appears so confident about what they know. What I always tell people is, the more confident somebody appears about something, and the more, especially if they're like pushing something as kind of like it's the best thing for everything, you can be pretty likely that person is actually full of it.
Yeah, I would say definitely the smarter you are, the more you know, the more you realize you don't actually know. And as you're saying, like the clickbait titles, be careful of the clickbait titles. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And for me, is the person just somebody who looks good, or do they have an education and some experience to go with that, the two together? Because if you're one or the other, if all you've done is read studies, like somebody could be highly educated, they're reading all the studies, but they've never actually done it in the real world. How do you know that information that you've read that seems to make sense actually applies to people in the real world? But if you can do both, then it's much more likely that it's going to be true. You've read the study, you've applied it yourself, and you can say, based on these studies and my experience, this is what I think. That to me is the best kind of information that you can get.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is just not always having a hint of skepticism with people you follow. And I tell people who follow me, like even me, like you should have some skepticism, because I've got my biases. Everybody's got bias. Anybody who says they don't have bias, you can be sure they have the most bias. Okay. Yeah, because I've seen PhDs say things where I'm like, what? I've seen people who have great physique say stuff where I'm like, are you insane? So, just understanding that, okay, people, like if somebody, let me give you kind of how I look at it. It's kind of like areas of confidence, like degrees of confidence. If somebody like has a really good physique and they also have a PhD, like I'm going to have more confidence going in and probably give them more leeway to what they say than I would somebody who's just Joe Schmo, right? Like if somebody has an advanced degree, I'm going to say, okay, they've been through this rigorous academia, hopefully. I'm going to give them a little bit more leeway. But even then, you've got people who are very well educated who believe insane things. And one of the downsides that I think is that cognitive dissonance tends to affect smart people even worse than it does dumb people, because smart people will use their own intelligence as validation of why they must be right. Because, well, I wouldn't believe something insane. I wouldn't believe something stupid, The other thing to look for is like if you press people on, information to cite things to support their arguments, if they start deferring to, well, let's see who paid for the study, or they start deferring to, like conspiracy theories and those sorts of things, you can look at a vegan documentary and then look at like things that carnivore people say, and it's the same playbook. It's all the establishment lied to you, and people, they don't want you to get healthy, and these organizations are trying to harm you. And it's like, well, wait a minute, you guys are like on opposing ends and you're saying the same thing. Like you can literally just sub out the words and it's the same sort of rhetoric. So looking for those sorts of things, or just like when somebody, for example, brings a study to me and they're like, hey, Layne, this study contradicts some of the stuff you said. My first response is not, well, who funded the study? My first response is, well, let me go read the study. And first off, let me see if it's saying what you're saying it's saying, because 90% of the time when people say, hey, the study said this, I'll read the results and say, that's not what it said. And then the other, part of it is, let me read the methods. Let me understand why maybe they saw what they saw, and almost without exception, maybe in one or two cases, I've read a study where I'm like, I just can't explain this. But in almost every other case, when I read the study and I read the results, I'll say, okay, I understand why they found this because of X design, or because they measured it this way, or, those sorts of things. But unfortunately, that's a lot of nuance for the average person to kind of understand, and they just tend to default to the person who screams the loudest.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like my brother says, when I watch your videos, I assume everything you're saying is wrong until I know it's right. I'm just not going to take your word for it right away. I need to be shown that. And so when I watch somebody saying this study said that, I'm like, okay, I'm going to go read that study. And I'll go read that study. And if I don't get it, ask Steve. I'll be like, what do you think about this? Oh my God, I can't believe they said it like this. I can't believe they summarized it. They're saying it says it didn't say that at all. I've done that. I've exposed doctors. It's embarrassing sometimes, the things that they just cherry pick and say, and they just post a quick little screenshot of a study said this, and it doesn't even say anything that they're saying. They sometimes will show the wrong study. It's horrible. So my advice to people, be careful. Don't take everyone's word for it just because they say it. Actually go and read the study. And the problem is, are you even capable of reading that study and understanding it? And if you're not, then just don't automatically assume that whatever that person's saying is right.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons, actually, one of the things we're working on right now is coming up with a research review for my website. so that we're going to like review like 5 studies every month that are relevant for fitness and nutrition, and kind of go through them, but in a very palatable way so people can understand them. But talking about your brother who's a statistician, I mean, honestly, I wish I'd done more with stats when I was in graduate school, because I just hated stats because it was very boring. But if you know stats, you can read almost anything and understand what it's saying to you. And advanced statistics are very, very important. I've actually gone back into reading more about stats now, as being 10 years out of grad school than I did in grad school. I mean, I knew how to run an ANOVA, and I knew how to run a t-test and all those sorts. I understood what p-values meant and whatnot. But there's so many more advanced statistics that can really tell you, like, okay, p-value is only part of the story. Here's all this other stuff. And I just wish I'd spent more time on that. But, I would say my strength is really experimental design, like really getting into the nuts and bolts and saying, well, I would say in probably a third of studies, they're not even designed to test what they want to test. Like I realize I'm kind of throwing a haphazard number out there, but yeah, in many of these studies where somebody will say, well, hey, this is what it showed. I'm like, but it wasn't even set up to test that. I think that's really the biggest thing, is not over interpreting the results of a study and really just taking it for what it is, right?